Hello, everybody. It's now the sixth week of the spring 2019 semester in British literature. All right, so before I talk about this week's work, I need to say a few comments about everybody's grades. There are many students in this class who have passing averages. Several students have A averages, many Bs, a few Cs, but we have a few people that are trying to stay caught up and that are at least passing the class moving forward. Then there's the other end of the spectrum where people have not turned in any work at all. I have gone into the grade book now and I've entered zeros anywhere where there's a missing assignment, whether it's a quiz, whether it's a essay, or whether it's a romanticism exam. And at this point, you can go into the grades section on the top of the page and take a look at where you're at. If you have a D or an F right now, it's most likely because you're missing a lot of work and you have a decision to make. Midterm grades are coming up in a couple of weeks, and then there's a drop deadline coming up, I think a week or two after that. And honestly, if you are now in the sixth week and you've turned in nothing, or you've maybe turned in one or two assignments, it's time to make a decision. It's time to decide whether you're going to try and stay caught up in the class, or whether you're going to perhaps withdraw and maybe take the class again in the fall. In fact, for some students, withdrawing now and taking the class in the fall might not be a bad thing to do if, for example, the reason you're behind is because of outside obligations that have nothing to do with school. I got an email box full of emails on Friday, students telling me, oh, I'm going to do 5 weeks worth of work over the weekend, and predictably, that didn't happen. In fact, it's very predictable to suspect that people cannot do 5 weeks worth of work in a single weekend. So I'm not going to reopen any missed quizzes at this point. I'm not going to reopen the romanticism exam. We are now in week 6, and at this point, if you have not turned anything in, you need to think about whether you want to stay in the class or not. End of story. All right, so with that lecture out of the way, we finished this book last week. That's why we had the romanticism exam, is that we are now done with that book. And this week, we are starting the Victorian Age. The Victorian Age is personally my favorite time in the British literature spectrum. We're going to be reading a lot of really good authors. And we're going to start this week with Alfred Lord Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson, when people think about Victorian poetry, Tennyson is one of the heavy hitters in that era. In fact, he was actually something known as a poet laureate for, I think, a couple of decades. He was that important to literature and to poetry during the Victorian era. And his poetry spans about 40 or 50 years. He wrote for a long, long time. The two poems I'm going to have you read this week and write an essay on have to do with incorporating mythology and maybe modernizing it, or perhaps looking at it from a different viewpoint. One of those is The Lady of Shalott, which looks at the King Arthur legend. And The Lady of Shalott is really a poem about a young lady who actually is trapped in a castle, and she's spinning some thread, and she's told that if she looks outside the castle, she's going to die. And lo and behold, young lady that she is, she sees a reflection in a mirror of Sir Lancelot, who was this handsome knight in King Arthur's court. And she turns to look out the window, and a curse falls upon her, which will eventually end up leading to her death. But one way to look at this poem is that it's about the literal death of a character. Another could be it's about the loss of innocence, or the death of childhood, or anything like that, gaining experience, which would eventually lead to one's end. So take a look at that poem as a coming-of-age story, if you will. And I think that you'll understand the poem and the themes that Tennyson's doing there a little bit better. The other poem I'm having you read is Ulysses. And Ulysses actually takes place after the Odyssey. So Ulysses was the name of the hero, if you want to call him a hero, of the Odyssey, a man who took 20 years getting back home after the Trojan War to his wife. And he goes on some adventures along the way. He has to fight off a Cyclops. He has to fight off Circe. He has to, resist the Song of the Sirens. You may be somewhat familiar with the Odyssey itself. And he gets home and he finds that his wife is now 30 years older because he's been gone for 30 years. And his son is now a man. He's no longer a little boy. And he has to fight off a lot of suitors who had been living off his land and eating his food and all kind, trying to get with his wife, if you will. And so this story takes place after all of that. He's now a king. He's been restored to the throne of Ithaca. He now is bored because now he's sitting on the throne listening to court cases instead of out having grand adventures like he had been doing for so many years. And he decides it's time to go back out into the world. He decides, hey, it is now time for me to turn my kingdom over to my son and to actually go back out and have one last adventure, one last woohoo, if you will, before death. So it starts off as a dramatic monologue, which is a conversation between him and somebody else, and you only hear his side of the conversation. And then he gives this grand speech to the people he's about to go out on a boat with before the adventure. So these are two reimaginings of some classic stories, the King Arthur legend and the Odyssey. And I hope that you'll enjoy them both. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me. And again, look at your grades. If you're passing the class, you're probably going to be okay. If not, you are now way behind, and you need to decide whether this class is going to be enough of a priority for you that you're going to continue it, or if you're going to continue to be distracted, in which case catching up at this point is going to be very, very difficult and not impossible.